Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our webinar. Bienvenue, mesdames et messieurs, à notre webinaire. There are several of us in this virtual room, journalists, civil society representatives, as well as OECD delegates. I'd like to also welcome those of you who are following the event live online. I am Joël Bassoul, and I manage communications on development cooperation at the OECD. We are here to discover the preliminary figures for official development assistance, ODA, in 2025 and projections for the coming year. ODA is foreign aid from the 34 members and associates of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, to developing countries. I say preliminary figures because the final statistics with a detailed breakdown by geographies and by sectors will be available as usual at the end of this year. To present these figures and give you early analysis and comments, we have with us OECD Secretary General Matthias Cormann, who will give us the big picture and share his reading of the evolution over 2025. Pilar Garrido, OECD Director for Development Cooperation, who will go into details on the trends and projections. And Carsten Storr, who chairs the Development Assistance Committee and will put these figures into perspective for us. We will then have about 20 minutes for questions. If you wish to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom and specify your name, your affiliation, and to whom you would like to direct your question, either Pilar or Carsten. And we also have with us Harsh Desai, our Manager of Data Collection, for more technical questions. The Q&A window is already open, and you can write your questions in French or English, starting right now. Mr. Secretary General, I am turning to you for your statement on ODA in 2025. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to this launch of the OECD's preliminary report on official development assistance trends and statistics for 2025. Developing countries are navigating a complex and challenging environment. The evolving conflict in the Middle East is, of course, weighing on growth everywhere, on food security, and having driven up energy prices and disrupted key supply chains, including for essential inputs for food production like fertilizers. Fiscal pressures on developing economies also continue to grow. For example, sovereign bond debt in non-OECD emerging markets and developing economies reached a record $12.1 trillion US in 2025, equivalent to around 30% of GDP and up from $5.3 trillion or 21% of GDP back in 2015. For nearly 20% of the bond debt issued by low-income countries in 2025, interest payments will exceed the principal amount, which is up sharply from the 6% back in 2019. In that context, then, official development assistance helps countries manage some of these pressures, laying the foundations for growth and resilience while supporting vulnerable communities. Our preliminary data release today shows that official development assistance has fallen as donor countries manage competing fiscal pressures. The volume of official development assistance by member and associate countries of the OECD Development Assistance Committee amounted to $174.3 billion US in 2025, which is down from $214.6 billion in 2024. This represents a sharp drop of 23.1% in real terms, the largest annual fall on record, and follows a decline of 6.1% recorded last year compared to the previous year. Official development assistance in 2025 was equivalent to 0.26% of the combined gross national income of the donor countries, down from 0.34% in 2024. This sharp decline was mainly driven by the reduction in official development assistance volumes in the top 5 provider countries, which accounted for approximately 96% of the total decline last year. On the other hand, in Denmark, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Norway, Spain, and Sweden, official development assistance increased. Looking ahead, we project an overall contraction of 5.8% in 2026. To mitigate the impact of these declines, the OECD is committed to support providers and recipients of development assistance in maximizing the effectiveness and impact of available resources and using them to leverage new sources of finance. First, by reinforcing the quality and usefulness of development aid data. The ongoing review of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee will identify opportunities to improve development financing data, helping countries better plan and allocate resources in responding to emerging needs. This includes creating better synergies between official development assistance, the total official support for sustainable development standard, and the International Aid Transparency Initiative to capture the total spectrum of international financing flows. Second, by strengthening the role of official development assistance in mobilizing private capital. OECD data shows that private finance mobilized by official development finance projects increased from $15.3 billion in 2012 to $76.9 billion in 2024. But we need to go further in the wake of falling official development assistance budgets. Our new compendium of good practices on quality infrastructure, developed in cooperation with our colleagues at the World Bank, provides recommendations to effectively unlock more and better private sector investment in infrastructure. This compendium draws on the experiences of a wide range of countries, including Honduras, Japan, Indonesia, and Nepal. Third, by supporting developing countries as they transition out of official development assistance eligibility. For example, last year, the Development Assistance Committee adopted a reformed development assistance graduation process, increasing the notification period for graduation from 2 to 9 years. This will allow countries more time to prepare and plan for graduation, including identifying alternative sources of financing. And now, as part of its ongoing review, the Development Assistance Committee is assessing the most effective ways to create a better supported graduation process. This includes, for example, broadening the basis for graduation decisions to incorporate factors beyond gross national income. Fourth, by helping to address barriers to increasing additional domestic resources, raising additional domestic resources. OECD data shows that tax revenues as a share of GDP in the average African country increased from 15.6% in 22 to 16.1% in 23, while they remained broadly stable in Latin America and the Caribbean at 21.4 and 21.3% in 22 and 23 respectively. But this remains well below the OECD average of 33.7%. A stronger, more transparent tax collection mechanisms can help enhance governments' capacity to raise the resources they need. Tax Inspectors Without Borders, our joint program with the United Nations Development Program, has helped developing countries generate an additional $2.4 billion in tax revenue so far, and over $6.39 billion in tax assessments across 70 jurisdictions over the past decade. And through the Global Forum on Transparency for Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, we have supported developing country members to uncover $52 billion US in additional revenues in 2024 alone. As part of the Sevilla Platform for Action, the OECD has also conducted a mapping of resource mobilization capacity building needs in Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tunisia. This mapping will help inform better coordinated support for these countries in reducing the cost of capital, designing bankable projects, and using innovative financing instruments such as green bonds. And there might be opportunity to expand our activities in this space further. In closing, official development assistance continues to be an important source of financing for development, but growing pressures on available resources will require donors and recipients to adapt, and it means further increasing the effectiveness and impact of development aid, unlocking complementary resources for sustainable development, and boosting tax collection in developing countries. A high-level conference on the future of development cooperation here in Paris next month will bring together government, civil society, and private sector representatives to discuss how best we can take these priorities forward. I will now hand the floor to our Director for Development Cooperation here at the OECD, Pilar Garrido, to present the data and trends in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And as the Secretary General has underlined, official development assistance has long played a critical role in supporting stability, protecting the most vulnerable, and enabling investment in sustainable development. But today, ODA is facing one of the most significant tests in decades, against the backdrop of heightened geopolitical tensions and fiscal pressures. Let me walk you through the key trends emerging from our latest preliminary data on the flows and composition of total ODA. Preliminary data for 2025 showed that the ODA from DAC members and associates amounted to $174.3 billion, or an equivalent of 0.26% of their combined GNI. Measured in real terms, total ODA fell by 23.1% compared to 2024. This is the largest annual contraction ever recorded and the second consecutive year of decline. The fall was driven primarily by a sharp reduction in bilateral aid from DAC donors, which declined by 26.4%. This affected humanitarian aid, as well as development programs, projects, and technical cooperation. Within bilateral ODA, grants declined by 29.1% and loans by 10.3%, while private sector instruments increased by 13%, amounting to 3% of total ODA. Multilateral ODA also declined by 12.7%. In effect, total ODA has fallen back to levels last seen at the start of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015. Looking at volumes by donor country, Germany became, for the first time on record, the largest DAC provider of ODA in 2025, with $29.1 billion, accounting for 16.7% of total DAC ODA. This was followed very closely by the United States, with $29 billion, the United Kingdom, Japan, and France. Meanwhile, four providers, Norway, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Denmark, exceeded the UN target of 0.7% of GNI. At the aggregate level, DAC ODA amounted to just 0.26% of GNI, its lowest share since 2004. Non-DAC providers also remain important actors in development cooperation. For this preliminary release, 12 non-DAC providers voluntarily reported data to the OECD, with additional reporters expected for the final figures in December. Among those reporting, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates stood out as the largest providers, both in absolute terms and relative to GNI. The decline in ODA was broad-based but concentrated in a few large providers. 26 out of 34 DAC members reduced their ODA. The five largest providers, Germany, France, Japan, the UK, and the US, accounted for 95.7% of the total decline, with the United States alone accounting for 3/4 of it. This was also the first time on record in which all five of the largest DAC providers reduced their ODA simultaneously. This chart shows how the composition of ODA has evolved over time on a net basis. The dark purple area at the bottom represents bilateral development programs, projects, and technical cooperation. Historically, these flows have been relatively resilient. Between 2019 and 2024, they increased by 24%, even as other parts of ODA fluctuated. But in 2025, they fell by 26.3%, the largest decline ever recorded for this component. This is significant because it tells us that the cuts in 2025 went beyond the components of aid that tend to fluctuate year to year, like humanitarian assistance and in donor refugee costs, and into the long-term development programs, projects, and technical cooperation. in donor refugee costs declined by 22.1%, and humanitarian assistance from DAC members fell by 35.8%. The picture for ODA to Ukraine is more complex. Net bilateral ODA from DAC members to Ukraine fell by 38.1% in 2025 to $10.3 billion. This was driven largely by a 91% decline in US net bilateral ODA to Ukraine, even as 23 DAC countries increased their support. However, when we include outflows from EU institutions, the picture reverses. EU institutions provided 34.6 billion to Ukraine, a 65% increase over 2024. So taken together, bilateral ODA to Ukraine from DAC members totaled $44.9 billion, an increase of 18.7%, and the largest volume of ODA ever provided to a single recipient in any year. This amount exceeded DAC members' combined bilateral ODA to all least developed countries and to all countries in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, bilateral ODA to the most vulnerable groups of countries fell sharply. Humanitarian assistance declined for the second consecutive year, following 5 years of sustained growth from 2019 to 2023 in response to successive global crises. Net bilateral ODA to least developed countries fell by 25.8% to sub-Saharan Africa by 26.3%. These declines are especially concerning because they follow a period when DAC countries had used the multilateral system to partly offset those bilateral cuts to these groups. With multilateral ODA now also declining for a second year in a row, it is uncertain whether multilateral organizations' buffering role can continue. The final data to be published in December 2026 will allow us to assess this more fully, but the preliminary picture is clear. The countries most in need are among those experiencing the steepest declines. If we are to speak about multilateral ODA, this amounted to $47.9 billion, a decline of 12.7% and 21.3% lower than in 2023. The reductions were concentrated in core contributions to the United Nations system, which fell by 27%, the largest annual decline on record. This was driven primarily by cuts from the United States of 87.2%. By contrast, core support to the World Bank increased by 6.7% and to regional development banks by 11.9%. Within multilateral ODA, we see a divergence with the United Nations systems disproportionately affected. ODA has long been viewed as a dependable and counter-cyclical source of finance. Between 2019 and 2023, ODA rose by 33% in real terms as DAC members respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. That trend has now reversed. ODA declined by 6.1% in 2024 and by 23.1% in 2025. Leaving overall levels 4.2% below those of 2019, despite continued economic growth across DAC countries. Looking ahead, political and fiscal pressures are likely to persist. Based on a survey of DAC members' countries, the OECD projects a further 5.8% decline in ODA in 2026. If confirmed, this would mark the 3 consecutive years of decline, something not seen since 1993 to 1995 in the period of the end of the Cold War. These projections do not yet account for the potential impact of the current crisis in the Middle East, which could represent an additional shock after 2 years of ODA cuts. The OECD will continue to monitor the situation and provide a more detailed analysis of its projections of ODA in the forthcoming policy brief on the ODA outlook this summer. And with that, I would like to hand the floor to the DAG chair of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, Ambassador Carsten Stauer, to share his take on this latest figures and trends.
Thank you very much, Pilar. And let me first of all thank you. Sorry. Let me start all over again. Let me first of all thank the Secretary General for his introductory remarks. Let me also thank Pilar. Let me thank the DCD Directorate, the dedicated teams of DCD for the thorough analysis presented here today, providing the transparency, the accountability, and the evidence base that is the hallmark of the DAC. This is the fourth time I have the pleasure of taking part in this annual launch of the preliminary ODA figures and trends, and this time the message is extremely somber, even dramatic. Official development assistance from the 34 DAC members dropped almost a quarter from 24 to 25, 23.1%. It now stands at $174 billion US. Never before in history have we seen such a sudden dramatic decline in ODA from one year to the next. Never. And the huge drop hits where ODA is most needed, in life-saving humanitarian situations, in sub-Saharan African countries, in LDCs, in countries in situations where there's no alternative, no substitute for ODA, in countries that are severely debt distressed, in poor, vulnerable, fragile countries now facing an even deeper economic and social crisis due to the situation in the Middle East. It's clear from the evidence, and both Pilar and the Secretary General also pointed to this, that the overall ODA cuts are primarily due to simultaneous cuts in the 5 top donors, accounting for 96% of all cuts, and especially one donor who represents 3/4 of all ODA cuts last year. But it's also clear that many other DAC members are confronted with significant budgetary, security-related, or political pressures, while some are admirably reversing the downward trend. The political support for Ukraine remains steadfast, but it's only maintained financially through the unprecedented increase in budget support from the EU institutions. It's deeply concerning also to see a very critical drop in DAC members' financial support for the UN development system, which underpins the operational reach of the UN and its foundational values. There are a few points of light in the overall depressing picture. In-donor refugee costs are going down in tandem with overall ODA. Funding for the World Bank and for the regional development banks is going up. So is financing through private sector instruments, although from a very low starting point. The trends and figures presented today do not come as a surprise. OECD and the DAC has for the past year consistently projected a likely up to 20% drop in DAC members' ODA in 2025, based on the information, the evidence that we have received from members. We have seen the pressures building over the last few years. A new American administration, increasing budgetary pressures in many other DAC members to get their economies on a better footing, demands for a vast increase in defense spending across Europe to face off growing and very real threats from an ever more aggressive Russia. Mercantilist, populist, autocratic pressures in some political quarters, advancing zero-sum approaches and rallying around or against the very ideas of globalization. Mindful of the rapidly changing global environment, DAC has initiated an open and inclusive review of its own role and functioning to help ensure that members' ODA priorities match the new global challenges and that they align with foreign policy objectives of building strong, mutually beneficial partnerships around the global agenda. The mega threats are still out there. The increasing security threats emanating from rogue states, from terrorism, proliferations of weapons of mass destruction, hybrid warfare, increasing polarization. The profound and devastating repercussions of climate change, the risk of new pandemics, the potentially dangerous consequences of growing political, economic, and social fragility, of disparity and instability, both within countries and between countries, and the inherent risk of new digital technologies, of mis and disinformation that, if not reined in, may impact democracies and limit personal freedom, voice, and agency. We know what we have to do. We know that we have to deal with both the short-term crisis and the longer-term threats, and to do it at the same time. We know that we have to work together as a global community to be able to do so. We also know that there are huge opportunities in this as well. Turning the tide, changing the downward spiral into an upward trajectory, creating a better future for the 8 billion people on this planet, step by step. To do so, we need to refocus on the core values of solidarity, of partnerships and security, and to refocus on the catalytic potential of international development cooperation and of ODA. First, ODA can help save millions of human lives very directly in situations of brutal conflict and disasters. It can help partner countries eradicate extreme poverty, leaving no one behind. There are still more than 800 million people living for less than $3 a day, 2/3 in sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of children still die every year before the age of 5 of reasons that are easily preventable. There is no substitute for ODA in this fundamental endeavor, investing in human relief, in health, education, social protection. Second, ODA can help partner governments improve policies, institutions, governance, domestic resource mobilization, not least through technical assistance, through knowledge sharing, capacity building and training, supplementing what is also a key feature of South-South cooperation. In so doing, ODA should align better with national priorities, plans, and policies, and with national budgets as well, supporting government focus on accountability, on civic space, and on the rights and fundamental freedoms of citizens. Jointly, we also need to overcome the increased fragmentation of aid, reduce transaction costs, and standardize aid modalities to deliver on even more impact, more value for money. Third, ODA can help partners mobilize more private finance for development from international sources, including investments for renewable energy, security, and other key aspects of the green transition, through blended finance instruments, and through making full use of the potential of IFIs and DFIs. Export-led growth, more value-added integration into global and regional supply chains, the creation of millions of new jobs, all that remains essential for emerging economies and developing countries. And for this to work, we must also support the multilateral system, which remains key to upholding the rules enabling global and regional security and stability, ensuring economic growth and prosperity. The ongoing DAC review is a commitment from DAC members to engage better with both partner countries and other providers, and to make our products, our data, our evidence-based analysis, our peer reviews, our standard setting, and normative work, to make all of that more relevant to the wider international development cooperation community. It's also a commitment to openness and to inclusivity, to consultations and dialogue, which will be intensified very soon. The tectonic plates keep moving. The world is changing beneath our feet. International development cooperation will need to adapt to these very rapidly changing circumstances. For DAC members, ODA remains an essential investment in global solidarity, in viable international partnerships and alliances, and in longer-term resilience and security, encompassing both defense, development, and diplomacy. Projections indicate that ODA from DAC members will decline a further 6% this year, with the years thereafter uncertain. Let's make a joint effort to turn this trend around. We need more ODA, not less. We need DAC members to take a holistic view of all the major threats we are collectively facing over the coming decades, and to apply a longer-term and broadly defined investment horizon to an international development cooperation. There are no us versus them. There are only us, one global community. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. We will now turn to the Q&A session. First, I want to ask this question to Carsten. It came through. The data that we just announced was very grim. It shows that financial international solidarity is unraveling. What is the OECD's role in encouraging rich countries to maintain their support to those who need it in a time of multiplying crisis?
I think that the role of the OECD, the role of the DAC, is the one that it has always been. It is to bring together evidence, to bring together the data and the rationale for international solidarity, but also for the impact, the results of development cooperation in our partner countries, and in order and the potential of mobilizing private capital for development. It's very clear that ODA is not the solution to everything, but it's also very clear that ODA can play a very important catalytic role in driving development, in driving growth, and in driving economic welfare. So we will try to get the evidence. We will try to bring our members together, but also to bring other providers and partners together to discuss and to frame a coherent approach to how we actually move the world as one. And I think that task for the DAC, I think, is more important than ever. And that's also where the DAC review can play a role in actually opening up, creating more inclusive approaches to how we actually, as one, as a global community, as all states and all stakeholders, actually be more agile, better, more effective in dealing with these issues. And eventually, of course, also be able to mobilize the funds. As I said, we need more ODA, not less.
The next question is about the last decade and the 3 consecutive crises that the world has seen in a very short time span. So first COVID-19, then the war in Ukraine, and now a new war in the Middle East. With ODA decreasing in such an alarming way, how will poor countries that rely on it recover?
I think that we need to ring fence ODA, basically. We need to be sure that a sufficient part of ODA is actually allocated to dealing with the dire situations in the countries that have the least resources, the poorest, the most fragile, the most vulnerable countries. There are a number of areas where ODA can play a useful role. There are a number of areas where there are other means of finance available. But for the issue of humanitarian relief, for the issue of poverty eradication, for the support of the poorest and most fragile countries, there's really no alternative to a heavy investment of ODA. So that has been the case all the time. What we have seen in the past decade is that ODA from 2019 onwards was a very good frame of actually dealing with crisis, in the sense that we were able to channel a lot of support for COVID, for support for our partner countries during the COVID crisis through ODA. Also that it has been a good frame for supporting Ukraine in the situation of the massive Russian attack in 2022. So ODA has also been a way to deal with global crisis. My hope is that we will use that strength once more and to look at the crisis that we are now facing and come back to seeing ODA as part of the solution to that multiple crisis that we now face, not least emanating from the Middle East, and that members of the DAC and other providers, other supporters of development cooperation will engage in collective thinking and collective action in order to bring about the political will that's necessary to mobilize the finance that is so much needed.
The next question is on the data to Pilar. In the data, Sweden's ODA has increased, but the government has made reductions. How do you explain the increase? Is it just technical?
What we have received as for now in this preliminary net bilateral ODA, and then it is that there is a 9.6% increase that is explained by their contributions to a multilateral ODA. But we will have more granularity on this in the December 2026 final figures.
The next question is on ODA to Ukraine. How can we justify a situation where a single geopolitical recipient is receiving more ODA than all of sub-Saharan Africa, when this region, sub-Saharan Africa, hosts the majority of humanitarian crisis?
I think that it's a good question. It's not an easy question to answer. If we go back to the situation before the Russian attack on Ukraine in February 2022, Ukraine received less than $1 billion a year in ODA. Since then, due to the Russian attack on Ukraine, the international community has been standing in solidarity with Ukraine, trying to protect and help the Ukrainian authorities protect their territorial integrity and make the country survive that vicious Russian attack. That's something that has been a political priority for a number of countries, not only in Europe, but also across the world, because this egregious attack on humanitarian standards and international law should not stand. So that's the reason that the international community is so strongly supporting Ukraine. But you also have to deconstruct the figures a little bit. If you look at Pilar mentioned the points here, the support for Ukraine from bilateral donors had actually gone down more than support for Africa had gone down in 25. What has taken support to Ukraine over the top, so to speak, which has actually created the situation where this is by far the biggest recipient or partner of development cooperation in history, is that there has been a lot of loans provided by the European institutions, loans that have been basically raised by private capital markets, and some of them are, of course, the ERA loans that European institutions has provided. So it's not, you cannot, in my view, compare the primarily grant provided assistance to sub-Saharan Africa to LDCs with the support for Ukraine. But the point is there, of course, that there is a huge support for Ukraine. I think it's political necessity given the geography and the geopolitical environment in the world. My point is not that we should reduce the support for Ukraine. My point is that we should increase the support for sub-Saharan Africa, for LDCs. So I think that's where we are failing to a certain degree, that we are not able to do both things at the same time, and we should be able to do that.
Thank you, Carsten. Turning to Pilar, the question is about the link between development and security. Is there some research, data, or evidence which shows that development and security are mutually exclusive?
The point is actually if you invest in development, you're investing in a long-term paradigm that would actually generate stability, and it would also generate more resilience. And it is actually reinforcing the idea that this is a continuum, and hence it is important to be able to address the short-term crisis with a particular set of tools, but also being able to invest in that longer-term partnership, which also speaks to the points that Carsten made in his intervention, because we know that long-term development and capacity building is good for stability, is good for preempting some of those crises, and also being able to build more security and a safer space for all.
Thank you, Pilar. This links, Carsten, to the next question, which is about the DAC and the efforts that the DAC is doing to increase effectiveness in ODA in recipient countries now that it's also decreasing.
Yeah, we are, I think, really preoccupied, not only because ODA is dropping. I think that's not the pretext for this. We have a constant responsibility to taxpayers and to stakeholders to be as effective, as impactful in our development cooperation as possible. We are aware that there are certain deficiencies in the way we do business right now. We are aware that we are too fragmented. We are basically we could achieve more as donors together with our partners to achieve more bang for the buck, more impact, more results on development cooperation than we are doing. But we are still doing fairly well, and we are moving forward on that agenda. And I think that for me, it's a really important agenda because it's basically the question of responsibility that we have as aid providers, that we make sure that the money that we basically bring to the table to support our partners is put to the best use possible. That's it has been a constant issue over many years. It's not a thing that we will ever finalize, an agenda we will ever finalize. We will still be able to improve as we move forward. The important thing is that we move forward and that we try to learn from our experiences. The system that we have in the DAC, our working groups, our networks, are all looking at how can we do better? How can we be more effective? How can we be more efficient? And how can we actually provide more impact for those that we want to help, for those governments and those people that we want to help. It's a constant challenge for all of us, but it's something that we take extremely seriously.
Thank you, Carsten. Turning now to the group that is most affected by the ODA cuts, which is least developed countries. They remain the most dependent on ODA as a critical source of financing for sustainable development. And in these countries, ODA has been considered a catalytic to leverage private finance. Yet there is persistent evidence that such approaches fail to reach or benefit LDCs, calling into question their effectiveness. So the question is, given this context, is it time to reconsider how ODA is allocated and move toward a model in which scarce concessional resources are more deliberately concentrated on LDCs?
I think that if we look at it, it's a very small part of ODA that's actually used for mobilized private capital. It's obvious that this is a field where it's more interesting to those that are engaged in private capital mobilization to do that in upper middle income countries or middle income countries, and it's more difficult to do that in low income countries and in LDCs. But it's, as I said, it's less than 3% of all ODA that actually is being channeled through private sector instruments. So it's something that we would like to see, and because we do really want to be able to mobilize more private capital through ODA, and we do think that there is a vacuum. There are a potential use of, or basically there are things that are not happening today because of lack of investment of ODA, and that there are potential of being able to invest small parts of ODA in actually unleashing, on mobilizing, on leveraging larger sums of private capital that can be beneficial for infrastructure investment or productive use or capital injections in partner countries. So in my view, there's no contradiction between moving towards eradicating poverty to assisting the poorest countries developing their institutions and their capacity, and at the same time, with parts of the ODA funds that we have available, also to mobilize private capital. I think it's something that fits well together in a more holistic approach to development.
Pilar, is there anything you would like to add on this approach?
Yes, just to say that it is also important to be specific about the different kinds of LDCs that we're speaking about, because each of them have particularities and different fragilities that they're faced with. So when you address them, you need a particular toolkit to be put into place. If we are to think about the goal that we had set ourselves, the United Nations goal to this population, we are right now at 0.07%, which is further in 2024, because we don't have the imputed multilateral data, so we cannot give you right now the 2025, but it will be potentially lower than this. But the point is that we will need to the most concessional resource there should be for LDCs and for those most fragile states, and then being able to also move forward into that and being able to adjust it. We also believe that there is when we think about some of those countries that are affected by conflict, there's a tendency that perhaps we should only do humanitarian and then take some of that development money into it. But the nature of it is what we have been saying for some time now, is that you should really use the HDP nexus. So being able to combine those resources, address prevention, but also being able to move closer because of the nature of the protracted crisis, then you also need to bring some of that development money in and think about reprogramming and being able to create the flexibility to best respond to the countries that are affected. So in the use of that concessional resources. But that's something that we have been working on, and when we and our new work on effectiveness and impact is also been thinking about this within the DAC review, how to best channel concessional resources to the most to specific realities at the specific times when they're most needed.
Thank you. So with regard to sector-specific ODA, the question that's come through with regard to bilateral development projects, do you envision that a similar drop will follow all sectors equally? Are you seeing that some sectors are more or less following separate trends?
I think that we will, of course, the good people, the good team at DCD will look into the numbers and the sectors. In the material that we make public today, we've been looking at some aspects, Indo and refugee costs, Ukraine, and so on. But on sectors, I think it's I think a fair game to assume that when we look at sectors, or when the staff look at sectors, there will be an impact of the fact that one donor, the United States, have been reducing its aid quite significantly, as I said, and that the sectors that have been traditionally very much at the center of American ODA will probably therefore also be seen as the ones that are falling most behind. The reference to humanitarian assistance, the drop of 35%, almost 36% humanitarian assistance, is also because that is an area where the United States traditionally has been a very trusted and very valuable donor to the world. And the same goes to health. So I would also imagine that when we look at health, that there will be we will see a drop in, but it's difficult to say, and of course more analysis by Harsh and colleagues will show that in more detail for us to announce that towards the end of the year.
Yes. Just to pick up on this point by Karsten, so we do see that given the concentration of the top donors on health, there might be a work hypothesis where we could say that this would continue to be one of those sectors more affected. But of course, we will need a bit more of time in for our final data to look into those more specific sectors and be able to provide you with more rigorous data.
And finally, a question to you, Karsten, after the presentation today. Do you see ODA ever recovering to previous levels? And what set of conditions are needed to bring that about?
It's a good question. If I look back to history, I look back to the 1990s, and you had a similar drop in the early 90s, not as concentrated as this over 1 or 2 years, but over a period of 5 or 6 years, there was a remarkable drop of ODA where it also dropped more than a third. Because basically the Cold War was over, there was the need to reinvent a new rational, new narrative around ODA. And that was also the time where Japan became all of a sudden the biggest donor and surpassing the United States also at that time towards the end of the 90s. I think we are in a similar moment right now. I think we are in a situation where we need to reconfigure and need to rethink ODA. In the past 30 years, ODA has been very much aligned to globalization, to the global economy, to free trade, to a growth, export-driven, growth-based rationale for investment and for job creation. Hopefully, a lot of that will survive, but we also do know that we are in a different trading environment, different economic environment, a more transactional economy now than we have been for decades. So I think we need to, I'm fairly optimistic that ODA will recover because I think solidarity is a very strong motive for mankind. But it may take some time for ODA to find its feet in that more complex, slightly different global environment than the ones that we have had through many years of globalization. And where the hyper-globalization of 20, 30 years ago are no longer there, but where we're looking at different rules for the global economy to work, and where ODA would need to find its feet in that changed global environment.
Thank you, Karsten. And many thanks to all of you for being with us. We could not, unfortunately, take all your questions, but we will do our best to respond in writing to those we have received. You will see the email addresses in the chat. If you wish to ask more questions or contact our experts, feel free to email us, and they are in the chat window now. Thank you all and have a good day.